So, welcome to another in our series of CUFI interviews. I'm Des Starritt, the Executive Director of CUFI UK, and today I'm pleased to interview Christina Jones from the Centre for Scotland and Israel Relations. Now, we've known Christina for a little while. She was down in the embassy in London for 2.5 years, and CUFI was very involved with the embassy, and Christina was actually our main point of contact in our liaison there. So, welcome, Christina.
Thank you so much, Des, for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak to yourself.
Well, we're really pleased to talk to you. We thought you'd gone, left the embassy, and maybe we wouldn't see you again for some time, but here you are, reappearing in Scotland.
Yes, did I plan on this? Not to some extent. Honestly thought maybe I was kind of done with Israel and was moving on a little bit, but no, I was offered this great opportunity, and so I'm still around. Not in the function and the capacity that you dealt with myself at the embassy, but in a different manner. So it's always good to reconnect with everyone and still be connected and have discussions.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe you could explain your new role and a little bit about the Centre for Scotland and Israel Relations, as it's known.
Amazing. So I am the director for Scotland and Israel Relations. I help liaise with the embassy. So I am affiliated with the embassy. And I am basically their point of contact for Scotland related matters. So I reach out to all spheres of Scottish society, and I'm basically building relations between Scotland and Israel. So I focus on trade, culture, MSPs, local government. So I encompass all spheres of Scotland, and then work with the embassy on it. So yeah,
Hey,
in
right.
short, what I do.
And did you have any connection with the football match the other day?
I did have a little work to do with that related to it. I was aware of what was going on. However, did I watch the game? No. I am not a football fan. I actually prefer ice hockey. But I'm fully aware both teams had issues in terms of the prominent players testing positive for COVID or injuries. So actually, it was quite an equal playing ground, and it came down to penalties, from what I believe. At the last minute, I think it was 5-3, if I'm correct.
Well,
But yes. So no, I didn't watch it, but I'm aware of the everything that went around it. So yeah.
brilliant. Okay, so well, personally speaking, then you mentioned about your interest in Israel. So what led you into the role you're doing?
Well, it's actually a really long story, and if I may, if I can share my own personal kind of background
That's
a little
fine,
bit,
please
how I
do.
came to this, because it's one thing after another that's led to it. So I actually personally, I know you guys know, but for everyone watching, I come from a Christian background. I was raised in an evangelical Baptist household. My parents are Canadian, hence the interesting accent. So it's not purely Scottish, but it's not purely Canadian, but depends who I talk to at the time as well. So it can go back and forth. But so I grew up in a Zionist household. My parents were always quite happy to, I wouldn't say influence us. They were more willing to share their opinions and where they had a perspective on terms of Israel. And so that was always kind of there. But they allowed us, for myself and my siblings, to make our own choice. But my family has actually been connected to Israel well before even my parents came along. My great grandfather was actually a personal friend of Lloyd George pre Balfour.
Right.
And because of his work as well, in terms of he actually ran a munitions factory down in England during World War One. He would have also most likely known Chaim Weizmann as well. So there's that connection there with Lloyd George, personal friend, and so fast forward a little bit to my grandfather. He himself was in World War II. He actually served in Italy, and he always said two things to me growing up as a child, and I can still vividly remember this. So the first one was, "Are you a Christian?" As any kind of good God-fearing gentleman would be, to making sure his grandchildren were saved and going to heaven. So I remember that. And the second thing he would always say to me, and I remember this the first time he said this to me at about 4 years old, he's like, always stand up for the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. And when you're 4 years old, you do not have the concept of Jews, Jewish people, Israel. You just see people. You see who you interact with. You know exactly who your family are, and you just see everybody else in the world. You don't distinguish between gender, race, religion, or anything like that. So I remember I went to my dad afterwards, and I was like, "Who are these Jewish people? What's Israel?" You know, as a 4-year-old does. Like, I want to know. And my dad didn't really have an answer other than, it's okay, don't worry about it, you'll learn in time. And consistently through the years, my grandfather, until he passed away, would always say these two things the first time I would show up to see him, no matter what, before we had even a discussion. And I used to always be like, Grandpa, I've told you how many times I'm saved, don't worry. And then I'd always hear this Israel aspect, but it sunk in, but never to some extent sunk in. And then obviously growing up with my parents, it kind of started making more sense when I started to understand my faith a little bit more as like a teenager and everything. My parents actually took us to Israel the first time when I was, I'm gonna say 14. It was during the second intifada, so I was completely blissfully ignorant what was going on as well. But I knew when I went there, I just fell in love with the nation. Like, I just loved it. I knew I was going to come back to some extent. When I was older, just didn't know. When you're 13, you don't want much. So I was just like, I'm going to do this. And then moving a little bit more forward, I started to get more interested in Israel. Obviously, my parents would talk to me about it, but it was my own personal, I started researching it more and just really kind of made my own decision about it during university. So I got involved in, not too much, but it was just more like on my own personal Facebook, just saying like, I support Israel, I support the IDF, blah, blah, blah. So I actually received a lot of online abuse in university, from my own peers in my own university course. The abuse I received was actually disgraceful, but I didn't block them or anything because people are allowed their opinion. However, there was a point where it was pretty bad. So I was abused online. And then during my final year of my program, I had the crazy idea. And trust me, I hated university and just suddenly was like, I'm going to do a master's. So my bachelor's is actually in archaeology and history. So decided Israel's the best place to go for archaeology. And then I was like, oh no, how am I going to afford this? I've not even been accepted. So I was like, okay, let's just go with this, ride this train a little bit. So I sent my application in the December. I heard back in the January that I'd been accepted to the program. And I was like, oh boy, I didn't expect that so fast. I was like, okay, this is interesting. And I remember telling people in my course, they were like, you got accepted to a master's? And I was like, yeah, I know, isn't it kind of funny? Considering I was considered the dumb blonde of the course. And all those who were the smarty pants were kind of jealous, I guess, that I got my acceptance before they did. And so then I was like, oh no, how am I going to afford this? So I was like, okay, God. So I had a prayer and I was like, okay, well, there's a scholarship for $5,000 to pay just partially for the program. If I get this scholarship, it means I'm meant to go. So I handed in my paperwork, did all that. I got a scholarship, and I was like, uh-oh, I kind of made a deal with God on this one, didn't I? So I was like, so I called a family meeting. To this day, I actually think my parents thought I was going to tell them I was pregnant because it was so serious. And I was like, okay, I've kind of done something and didn't tell you. And they're like, my mom was like, are you pregnant? And I was like, no, I'm going to university, my master's. I'm trying to ask you for thousands of pounds. And they were like, what? And I explained to them all of this. And they were like, okay, we have to pray about it, come back to you about this. And I was like, okay, do what you got to do. Because I'm asking for a lot of money. So they came back and were like, okay, we'll do it. It means we're supporting Israel. Is how they saw, and if they could bless Israel in some capacity, whether it be me going or in any other way, they were fine with it. So I ended up going. I did my master's for 3.5 years in Israel, but my time actually in Israel wasn't the greatest. My program was very difficult and it kept changing a lot during it. I also too was in a really bad relationship, and I was actually there during the last conflict with Gaza. So I was actually during the entire time I was excavating about 28 kilometers from Gaza. So
Wow.
you could see all the rockets going to Ashdod. I remember actually hearing this huge bang. It was a different bang than any other rockets that we've heard. And then all of a sudden we could not see Ashdod. Like it was, I don't know if you remember, they took out a drone that came across Ashdod. And I actually heard it and saw it falling like down from the sky and just not seeing anything. And actually our kibbutz was actually further closer to Gaza. So I think by that point we were about 15 kilometers to Gaza. And actually 2 rockets ended up landing. One hit the chicken coop of the kibbutz I was on, and one just landed outside the fence of the kibbutz. I actually wasn't there during this happening, but coming back and being told this, I was frantic because I was I was like 23, 24. I was like going crazy, like, no, this is unacceptable. Like, this is and because my course were like, no, you can just stay, you do this. And I was like, no, I'm an adult. Like, I choose myself what's safe for me or not. So there was all of this going on. My mother wasn't well. And eventually it got to a point where I just decided to come home. I made a snap decision. After 3.5 years, made a snap decision, came home. Because I was at the point where I could write my thesis. I had done all my research, which my research itself took quite some time actually, because I specialized in animal remains. So I was doing, for the biblical site that I was working on, I was examining all the late Bronze Age 2/3 animal bones. So I analyzed over 12,000 animal bones. And that's not including all the tiny little pieces that I couldn't even tell you how many there were. So you just kind of make up a number because you're not going to count all these little fragments. But my official report says 12,000. So it's a long time to do that because you have to learn everything. So I came home in about the January of 2017, and I was just fed up with Israel. Fed up. I knew I was still very supportive. I love the Jewish people. My time in Israel was great when I wasn't at university. So that was always positive, but just too much happened, and I was just like, okay, God, I'm done. Cool, done that. Time to close the book. Let's finish this thesis, get it done, and get a job in archaeology and history. I've studied it for near enough 8 years of my life. It's time to do that. However, every time I wanted to do something, it just always pulled me back to Israel somehow. So whether or not people asking me, can you speak at our Bible study, or can you speak to my son? He's about to go to Israel and he's looking for suggestions, or can you do this? What airline do you suggest to fly with? And I'm like, please, like, just go away. I don't want to talk about them anymore. I'm done. It's Israel. Cool. Like, I'll help you if I really have to, but don't want to spend my time doing it. And so I ended up actually during this time, I got a job at the airport. So I was working 12-hour shifts at the local airport here in Glasgow.
Okay.
And I was applying to at least 2 or 3 history/archaeology jobs during this time. Never got a response. I think got one response that ended up nowhere. So you can imagine applying just for 5 months solid and not getting anything was quite disheartening. And then eventually I was just like, I sat there and I was like, fine, God, I'll do this Israel thing because it seems to keep coming up. Whatever. Am I happy with it right now? Not great, but I guess this is the only thing going for me. But I also felt he was telling me like take a break from studying. I think it's not studying, from applying for jobs. So I took a break for 4 weeks, I think it was, to really just kind of focus and pray about everything and just kind of get my own focus back because I'd just been bouncing around doing so much during this time and I was just exhausted. So after the 4 weeks, I was like, well, I was like, send in my CV to the embassy. I'd applied before, so I was like, here's an updated one. And before I actually got through to panel interviews for the trade department, but have had no background in trade, so it was clear that I was never going to get it. So I sent in my CV and I heard back within 3 days from them, from the public diplomacy department. And I was so taken back. I was like, 3 days? Like, what? Are you that desperate? And they told me what jobs they had going on. So they told me they had for someone for Jewish community and someone who's to do with all the other communities. And they were like, what are you interested in? And I was like, well, I guess I'll do either or. Like, I'm not, at this point, I'm not fussy. But at that point, I was just like, wow, could I actually do this? Is this really where I'm meant to go? And started getting this sense of excitement and everything. And so I had my first interview, went well. This time I also didn't have to do, I had, the first time I applied, I had to do psychometric tests. I didn't do them this time. I assume because they may have still had something from the last time I applied. So I did my first interview, and then I went to the panel interviews, learned from the first time what not to say, what to say, I guess. And then it just kind of went radio silent for, I feel like 5 weeks, I think. So I'm sitting there getting all excited, but nervous. I'm like, they're not telling me anything. Like, it was dramatic, the change of how I went from being so uninterested and just being kind of ambivalent to being like, this is what I want to do. I know I can do this. And in total, after I finally found out I passed my security, that's what was taking so long, because I lived in Israel. So they had to obviously, I guess, check me out while I was there. And it was a process of about 5 months from when I first had that phone call to being told you can start on this date. And I basically upped and moved my entire life to London. It was the second move I'd done in less than a year, so it was quite dramatic again. And was at the embassy dealing with, I oversaw, as you know, Des, I oversaw the relations with all the faith communities at the embassy. So I dealt with the Christians, the Sikhs, Baha'is, Muslims, plus I also dealt with the local advocacy groups that support Israel. And so I was there for 2.5 years. I just left in June. But I made a conscious decision at the earlier this year that it was time to move on and, come home, I think, to be close to my family. And London is quite difficult in terms of finances and just how it's always in a speedy and it's go. So I've had my city experience, we'll put it that way. Yeah. And so eventually they were like, we're looking for someone to do. Actually, I knew before that I handed in my resignation, they were looking for someone for this role. So I kind of was just like, I'm going back to Scotland. It'd be great if you could, consider me for a candidate. And yeah, so they considered it and I got offered the role. And yeah, so now I'm here doing Scotland, and that's my whole big spiel. Sorry that took so long, but as you can see, my family's been very connected for so long with Israel, and it's just not on my mother's side of the family. That whole story I told you, my father's side as well. My father's actually adopted, but his adoptive mother also used to volunteer with the Jewish community in Canada, and we have no idea why. There's never been any kind of explanation as to why she was involved. So that's always been a mystery, but both sides of my family have always been kind of connected to the Jewish people in Israel to some extent. And yeah, so that's basically my story. So how I'm now in Scotland.
But it's a generational thing, which is really interesting, isn't it?
I guess so, yes. And as I said, with my grandfather, when he was in World War II, he saw what happened and knew what was going on with the Holocaust too, I guess. So that's why I think it really was poignant to him. And that was before he became a Christian too, actually, where he really formulated these opinions about, standing up for the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. He would have seen the establishment too post-war. So it has been generational since my great grandfather, so it's been ongoing.
No, that's great to hear, though. It really is. I mean, one of the things, certainly when we started CUFI a few years ago, we were very keen to get the younger generations involved.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that means investing, just like your parents did with you, and, it may not have seemed a direct sowing into Israel financially at the time, but clearly it has had the fruit of that, because you've been there, you've done what you've done in the embassy and now in Scotland. So it's
Yeah.
important to think about those next generations. And too often in the past, the pro-Israel support is, I've always said, grey-haired praying ladies, and in the Christian church, that tends to be the case. But if we can sow into the next generation, it makes such a difference.
Oh no, I completely agree. My parents have, sown into each of their children individually. With my brother and my sister, they took us all on, I guess, a quote unquote pilgrimage to find our Christian faith and to see where our Christian faith comes from. So my sister actually, when she went, she was well into her 30s. When my parents took her, she actually came across to help me move to Israel with my dad. And that was her first time in Israel.
Wow.
I mean, my brother's first time as well was when we went as children, but he came out and visited me too. So, I wouldn't say they're not necessarily outspoken for Israel, but they definitely have an appreciation. But I'm definitely the more outspoken in the family, given my positions that I've had. But I completely wholeheartedly, agree with you. It's trying to work with the younger generation, and it is difficult. We are seeing a decline, of people in my age group or younger not really supporting / doing anything for Israel. So it's trying to find that balance to try and, engage them, but maybe not in terms of the conflict, because that always is, what everyone wishes to discuss, but talk about more the social aspects, like how Israel is helping in terms of, their communities, in terms of the Ethiopian community and helping them thrive, coming from Ethiopia, or helping just general society. So Lekit, for example, deals with food redistribution, things like that,
Yeah.
These are topics that interest the younger generation today. So maybe include the biblical aspect to some extent, but not make it the biggest aspect for them, especially if they come from, a Christian household.
No, you do need to see those other perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly I'm within CUFI, apart from Remini and I, the older ones, we have a very young team, and we're keen to sort of get across a young message, which is why we've used social media so much. So yes, it's great to see younger people like yourself involved. That's
Thank
good.
you.
So what's it like being a Christian in Israel diplomacy? That's quite an unusual role.
I mean, I'm not actually I'm not a diplomat. So I guess to some extent I'm not actually in diplomacy, but to some extent I understand why you're saying that too. To be a Christian in dealing with Israel, especially when I was at the embassy, was fantastic. It was a great talking point for most people, especially with my peers from the Christian community. Engaging with them, they were always like so shocked, to learn that Israel employed a Christian,
Yeah.
especially, in the embassy. And now I'm also, my predecessor was a Christian for this role as for the center, and myself too. Um, so it's always a great point. And it really just shows that Israel is a diverse country, and, it's not just all Jewish people getting employed. There is a wide variety. And I don't know if you're aware, but the first Christian ambassador was appointed, George Deek. He's now the head in Azerbaijan. So he's been an advisor in the MFA for quite some time too. So, it's fun.
Yeah.
And it has challenges, but it really does show, as I said, the diversity of Israel. And, it's not just, that the Christian population, even though I'm not an Israeli Christian, it just shows you, that they recognize that the Christian community do contribute.
Yeah. And of course, in our days, I mean, we've seen a massive support from the Christian sort of community for Israel. And
Mm-hmm.
Netanyahu himself has said, that Christians are our biggest support base.
Especially the evangelical Christians. What in the UK they say unofficially there's 3 million evangelicals just in the UK. Officially the number is like 1 million. But we also need to remember that, Israel, as it is as a democracy, the Christian community is the only place in the Middle East where it's actually growing each year. on itself. So whereas you're seeing the rest of the Middle East, the Christian population depleting, it's growing in Israel. So I think that's a note that we should always remember too, which I think the media don't necessarily stress too much either. So.
No, well, certainly, I mean, when you look at the persecuted church,
Mm-hmm.
it's all around that area that Israel is growing, as you say.
Yes, so
So
we need to recognize that.
absolutely. So, what do you think are the sort of key issues facing Israel-Scottish relationships at the moment?
Oh boy. Key issues. I mean, I wouldn't say there's necessarily issues. I think we need to focus on the positives, you know. There's a lot going on in terms of Israel-UK trade, but it's also obviously beneficial to Scotland. So in terms of, I know for a fact there's universities in Scotland and Israel doing projects in terms of aging, and you know, there's a lot going on that is positive. So with my own engagement, we're seeing, you know, people who are willing to work with us. So a lot of people think that there's not much going on, and that, you know, for example, certain groups are trying to diminish the work that Israel's doing, and you know, trying to inhibit that there is any kind of relationships. But I am seeing thriving relationships in terms with MSPs, local governments, you know, um, bilateral relations just overall. I think so. I wouldn't say there's necessarily any key issues, but that, you know, things are overall doing very well.
Hmm. Well, we're certainly aware there's some pockets of anti-Israel activism in Scotland. I've certainly, been involved with CUFI events in Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
We've always had to add a bit more security, a bit more concern about who will be against us more so than who will be for us. I mean, I was involved in a conference actually in Edinburgh, where we had to almost run the gauntlet of sort of pro-Palestinian supporters chanting on the streets, and it was quite a vicious sort of protest against a relatively small conference in a
Mm-hmm.
church. So what's the sort of general picture, what the attitudes are like towards Israel in Scotland?
Well, you know, these groups that you're mentioning are very fringe groups, in my opinion, and we also have to remember they tend to um, vocalize the fact that they don't necessarily wish for Israel to exist overall. And we also have to remember they're not protesting any other nation in the world that has any issues, you know. Their main focus is Israel, nor do they criticize a specific policy of Israel at all. They just, you know, wish to really just ensure that the nation does not exist. So
See,
so yes, they are, you know, I would say they're a vocal minority.
yeah.
And we are very aware of them and what they're saying and what they're, you know, what's happening. But overall, as I said, the relations are doing phenomenal, even with these protests and these movements that are trying to stop the work.
Mm.
So.
Well, we're certainly conscious that the Christians within Scotland are supporting Israel,
Mm-hmm.
and in an increasing number. I mean, from CUFI's perspective, I mean, we're obviously a national organisation, but we have a lot of supporters in Scotland, right up to the very sort of top of Scotland. They may be a bit sort of further apart than down south, but certainly they cover the whole of Scotland, and there's
Definitely.
a good support base there. So we're really
Welcome.
encouraged by that.
And I'm completely encouraged and thankful to the support that they are offering as well. So I'm really happy to see that there are Christians, you know, that support Israel throughout Scotland, not just in certain regional like city centres.
No, that's absolutely right. And I say, sadly, we were planning to do more in Scotland this year. We had a regional conference last year in Stirling, actually. We were planning to have events up there again this year, but obviously because of lockdown, that's not been possible. But we will definitely return to Scotland. I mean, Reverend and I visit Scotland every year, at least once, often 2 or 3 times. I mean, my background is just from very close to where you are now, actually. And the Starritt family comes from a little place called Stair, which is just below Glasgow, to the west, to the east, sorry, there. So in that sort of region, very little, small little holding.
I'm
So
not gonna lie, I've never heard of it, but
no, what I say, it's a very small community of so just a few houses.
oh, okay.
Starritt family came from Stair, so that's where
Well,
that's
the
where the
things
people.
the things you learn. But you're saying that you can't have a conference in person. You can always do a digital conference too, on Zoom to
Yeah,
engage with your support base up here. And I'm obviously happy to work with you on that if
yeah,
you
we'll
so wish.
definitely be doing a lot more digitally this year, and we will
Yeah.
continue to do that. But we're looking forward to getting back up there to meet people face to face, and it was a great
Me too.
encouragement.
Me too. I haven't met anybody since doing this, since lockdown. So it's only a couple people. Because I actually had the deputy ambassador up last week for some meetings just before the football match. So that was the first time I was, I guess, allowed out to go and do and actually have meetings. So, but I cannot wait to have face-to-face meetings rather than this digital medium.
No, we're all looking forward to that, I think. Yeah. So, what ways do you think CUFI supporters listening in can demonstrate their support for Israel in Scotland? How can they get involved?
So I think the best way to get involved is, signing petitions. You have the example of yourselves at CUFI, and obviously you have We Believe in Israel and Israel Birth Alliance. So that's definitely, and we are seeing, and we do know that these petitions work. But I also would highly recommend you contacting your counselors, your local MSP, and discussing, these issues. Like, what is if there's a certain motion or something coming up, or you see an issue for maybe example, certain activity that's calling for the oranges in the supermarket that are Israeli not to be allowed in. Things like this. Talk to your local representatives, and get them engaged on the issues. I would also encourage you to, if you see an opinion piece in a newsletter, a paper, to respond to it, and if you ever need any information, please feel free to reach out to me. That's what I'm here to do, is help you guys. And, I'm here for any kind of issue. So it's not just what I've explained and just said here. These are just examples, but if there were anything to come up, please do feel free. I'm more than happy to, help with anything. But
Great.
these are what I would suggest to begin with.
So how can people connect with you then, Christina?
So you have my email address. I don't know if you'll share it with this, but you can also drop it in to this. I don't know how you will do this via the Zoom, but my email address is office@scotlandisrael.co.uk. But you can also reach out by, the Centre has a Facebook page. So it's Centre for Scotland and Israel Relations. It's a very long-winded thing. And that's the way to do it. I have a newsletter, which you can sign up to via a link on the Facebook page as well. Or if you just email me directly, I can add you to it. And I share events that's going on and things that are forthcoming or news that's just happened in the past little bit. So I'm trying to do that at least monthly to get a newsletter out. But also if there's events coming up that are happening right there and then that may be of interest, I will share it too. So this is the best way to get in touch with me.
Okay, well, we'll make sure your email address is available on screen at the end of this.
Yes, please. Thank you.
And I hope people connect with you because you're doing a great work up there already.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I've only been here 2 months and it's been crazy, crazy busy, but I'm really happy about it. And, I'm always looking for new connections. So if you want me to, any of those who are listening, connect with your pastor or anything or your reverend, I'm more than happy to do that. I'm also happy to have like a discussion or, depends if we can get a bigger audience to maybe even have a diplomat speak to them. So having an update about what's going on in Israel, because a lot has happened in a few months, isn't it? So, I'm more than happy to arrange these things, and this is what I'm here for.
Yeah, well, these are exciting times for Israel relations. So
it definitely is, especially with the Abraham Accords. So hopefully more will start normalizing relations, and we'll see a lot of progress.
Brilliant. Well, we'll be keeping in touch, Christina, and to say CUFI will definitely be up in Scotland as soon as those gates are open.
Oh, good. And I look forward to welcoming you, Remini, and the rest of the team, and I can't wait. And yeah, thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, Des.
We really appreciate you. So keep up the good work.
Thank
Well
you
done.
so much. You too. Take care.
Yeah, bless you. Take care.
Bye.